President,
Majority Leader.
are we in a quorum call at this stage?
We are.
I would ask consent that unanimous consent that be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent that we proceed to executive session to consider calendar number.
She said yes.
Calendar number 191, that the nomination be confirmed, the motion we consider be made, laid on the table, no intervening action or debate. No further motions be in order to the nomination, that any related statement be printed in the record, and the President be immediately notified of since action sent, then resume legislative session.
Without objection. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 21. Under the previous order, the time until 12 noon will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Report. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call, which I will suggest in just a few seconds, that the time during that be equally divided between majority and minority.
Without objection.
Note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate this morning in a brief holding pattern as senators continue to make their case for and against military action in Syria. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this morning stating his position against military strikes. And as the Senate here debates, the House Armed Services Committee is meeting this morning, hearing from Secretary of State John Kerry, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel as they provide testimony to that committee. You can see live coverage on C-SPAN 3. Quorum call continues this morning on the Senate floor as we await further debate on Syria. We'll go back to leadership remarks now this morning as the session got underway, hearing first from Majority Leader Harry Reid, followed by Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
We're engaged in a very important debate. The Syria debate is one that can't be taken lightly, and I believe that no one has taken it lightly. The discussion and the bipartisan resolution under consideration is simply too important to be rushed through the Senate or given short shrift. So it's right and proper that the President be given opportunity to meet with senators from both parties as he is today. He will meet with us at 12:30. When he finishes with us, it's my understanding he will report to the conference of Senator McConnell. In addition to that, he's going to address the nation tonight. He's going to speak directly to the American people about the potential for limited military action in Syria. He's going to do that at 9 o'clock tonight. As I said last night, it's appropriate to allow other conversations to go on. We now have, as a result of some work done by other countries, France, Russia, and we understand Syria is involved in this, and this is aimed at avoiding military action. We'll have to see if this works out. It's very important to understand that the only reason Russia is seeking an alternative to military action is that President Obama has made it plain and clear that the United States will act if we must. Our credible threat of force has made these diplomatic discussions with Syria possible. And the United States shouldn't withdraw from the direction we're taking as a country. If there's a realistic chance, and I certainly hope there is, to secure Syria's chemical weapons and prevent further atrocities of the Assad regime, we shouldn't turn our backs on that chance. But for such a solution to be plausible, the Assad regime must act quickly to prove their offer is real and not merely a ploy to delay military action or action of this body, the United States Senate. Any agreement must also assure chemicals, weapons in the hands of Syria can be secured. And this can be done in an open process, even in the midst of this ongoing war that we have in Iraq. And any agreement must ensure that Syria is unable to transfer its dangerous chemical weapons to the hands of terrorists in that area. Such an attempt would be met with a rapid response, and it would be robust from the United States. So I'm pleased that the administration is considering this offer. I am pleased that other countries are involved, in addition to Russia. It's my understanding it's my understanding that France is heavily involved as of a few hours ago, and I think that's the right direction at this time. And we move forward, but under the general criteria that I've suggested and outlined. The Senate should give these international discussions time to play out, but not unlimited time. That's why, although there's support to move forward and debate this bipartisan resolution reported by Senators Menendez and Corker, they did a terrific job for the committee last week. I didn't rush to file cloture, as indicated last night, and a motion to proceed to this. We don't need to prove how quickly we can do this, but how well we can do this. The Syrian regime should fully understand that the United States is watching very, very closely. And the Assad regime should be warned. Our country will not tolerate this breach of human decency and long-held international consensus against the use of chemical weapons. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the order with respect to S-1392, which is the energy efficiency legislation, be modified so that the motion to proceed be agreed to at a time to be determined by me with the concurrence of the Republican leader, not consultation with him, but with concurrence with him.
Is there objection? Without objection, so would.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, first I'd like to welcome the President to the Capitol today. Members on both sides of the aisle are eager to hear from him and to share their own thoughts. We look forward to a spirited and constructive exchange. It is often said that of all the questions we face as lawmakers, none is more serious or indeed more difficult than the question of whether to commit ourselves to military action. That's why it is so important for us to have this debate, to lay out the arguments for and against military action in Syria, to let the public know where we stand on this issue and why. But if debates like this are always challenging, in some ways this one has been even more difficult. Not because of some political calculus, though cynics will always suspect that. No, this debate has been made more difficult because even those of us who truly want to support the Commander-in-Chief have struggled to understand the purpose of the mission. Over the past several days, I've spoken with a lot of people, a lot of Kentuckians, And I have to tell you, most of them aren't exactly clear about the mission themselves, or shy about saying so. What I've told them is that I understand their concerns. I share them. I also appreciate the war weariness out there. But then I tell them there's other potential concerns that we can't ignore here either. Chief among them is the fact that the credibility of the commander-in-chief matters. And related to that is the fact that we can't afford as a country to withdraw from the world stage. So no one should be faulted for being skeptical about this proposal, regardless of what party they're in, or for being dumbfounded, literally dumbfounded at the ham-handed manner in which the White House announced it. There's absolutely no reason to signal to the enemy when and how and for how long you plan to strike them. None. As I've said before, you don't send out a save-the-date card to the enemy. And yet there are other important considerations to keep in mind here as well that go beyond the wisdom or the marketing of the proposal. I've spent a lot of time weighing all of these things. I've thought a lot about America's obligations and the irreplaceable role that I've always believed and still believe America plays in the world. And I've also thought a lot about the context, about this president's vision and his record, and what it says about whether we should be confident in his ability to bring about a favorable outcome in Syria. Because how we got to this point says a lot about where we may be headed. And that's why, before announcing my vote, I think it's important to look back at some of the president's other decisions on matters of foreign policy and national security, and then turn back to what he's proposing now in Syria, because in the end, these things simply can't be separated. Now, it's not exactly a state secret that I'm no fan of this president's foreign policy. On the deepest level, I think it comes down to a fundamentally different view of America's role in the world. Unlike the president, I've always been a firm and unapologetic believer in the idea that America isn't just another nation among many, that we are indeed exceptional. As I've said, I believe we have a duty as a superpower without imperialistic aims to help maintain an international order and balance of power that we and other allies have worked very hard to achieve over the years. The president, on the other hand, has always been a very reluctant commander-in-chief. We saw that in the rhetoric of his famous Cairo speech and in speeches he gave in other foreign capitals in the early days of his administration. The tone and the policies that followed were meant to project a humbler, more withdrawn America. And frankly, I'm hard-pressed to see any good that came from any of that. Any list would have to start with the arbitrary deadlines for military withdrawal and the triumphant declaration that Guantanamo would be closed within a year without any plan of what to do with its detainees. There were the executive orders that ended the CIA detention and interrogation programs. We all saw the so-called reset with Russia and how the president's stated commitment to a world without nuclear weapons led him to hastily sign an arms treaty with Russia that did nothing to substantially reduce its nuclear stockpile or its tactical nuclear weapons. We saw the president announce a strategic pivot to the Asia-Pacific region without any real plan to fund it and an effort to end the capture, interrogation, and detention of terrorists, as well as the return of an old idea that terrorism should be treated as a law enforcement matter. After a decade-long counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, we've seen the president's failure to invest in the kind of strategic modernization that's needed to make this pivot to Asia meaningful. Specifically, his failure to make the kind of investments that are needed to maintain our dominance in the Asia-Pacific theater, in the kind of naval, air, and Marine Corps forces that we'll need there in the years ahead, could have tragic consequences down the road. His domestic agenda has also obviously had serious implications for our global standing. While borrowing trillions and wasting taxpayer dollars here at home, the President has imposed a policy of austerity at the Pentagon that threatens to undermine our stabilizing presence around the globe. And of course, we've seen how eager the President is to declare an end to the war on terror. Unfortunately, the world just hasn't cooperated. They haven't cooperated with the President's vision or his hopes. Far from responding favorably to this gentler approach, it's become arguably more dangerous. We've learned the hard way that being nice to our enemies doesn't make them like you or clear a path to peace. I understand that the President ran for office on an anti-war platform, that his rise to political power was marked by a determination to get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq and declare an end to the war on terror. I know he'd rather focus on his domestic agenda, but the ongoing threat from al-Qaeda and its affiliates and the turmoil unleashed by uprisings in North Africa and the broader Middle East, not to mention the rise of Chinese military power, make it clear to me at least that this is not the time for America to shrink from the world stage. The world is a dangerous place. In the wake of the Arab Spring, large parts of the Sinai, of Libya, of Syria are now basically ungoverned. We've seen prison breaks in Iraq, Pakistan, Libya, and the release of hundreds of prisoners in Egypt. Terrorists have also escaped from prisons in Yemen, a country that is no more ready to detain the terrorists at Guantanamo now than they were back in 2009. And the flow of foreign fighters into Syria suggests that the civil war there will last for years, regardless of whether Assad is still in power. Yes, the President deserves praise for weakening al-Qaeda's senior leadership, but the threat we face from al-Qaeda affiliates is very real. These terrorists are adaptable. They're versatile, lethal, resilient, and they aren't going away. Pockets of these terrorists extend from North Africa to the Persian Gulf, and it's time he faced up to it. And it's time to face up to something else as well. International order is not maintained by some global police force, which only exists in a liberal fantasy. International order is maintained, its backbone is American military might. Which brings me back to Syria. For 2 years now, Syria has been mired in a ferocious civil war with more than 100,000 killed with conventional arms. That's according to UN estimates. This tragic situation has promoted many to look to the United States for help. And so 1 year ago, President Obama made a declaration. If Assad used or started moving chemical weapons, he'd do something about it. Well, as we all know, on August 21st of this year, that red line was crossed. The President's delayed response was to call for a show of force for targeted, limited strikes against the regime. We've been told that the purpose of these strikes is to deter and degrade Assad's regime's ability to use chemical weapons. So let's take a closer look at these aims. First, no one disputes that the atrocities committed in Syria in recent weeks are unspeakable. No one disputes that those responsible for these crimes against the innocent should be held to account. We were absolutely right, of course, to condemn these crimes. But let's be very clear about something. These attacks, monstrous as they are, were not a direct attack against the United States or one of its treaty allies. And just so there's no confusion, let me assure everyone that if a weapon of mass destruction were used against the U.S. or one of our allies, Congress would react immediately with an authorization for the use of force in support of an overwhelming response. I would introduce the resolution myself. So no leader in North Korea or Iran or any other enemy of the United States should take any solace if the U.S. were not to respond to these attacks with an action against Syria. We will never, never tolerate the use of chemical weapons against the United States or any of its treaty allies. Second, in the course of administration hearings and briefings over the past several days, Secretary of State Kerry has revealed that Assad has used chemical weapons repeatedly over the last year. So there's a further question here about why the administration didn't respond on those occasions. Third, Assad, as I've indicated, has killed tens of thousands of people with conventional weapons. Is there any reason to believe he won't continue if the president's strikes are as limited as we're told they would be? Fourth, what if degrading Assad's control of those weapons, if in doing that, you make it easier for other extremist elements like those associated with al-Nusra Front and al-Qaeda to actually get hold of them themselves? Or what if by weakening the Syrian military you end up tilting the military balance toward a fractured opposition that's in no position to govern or control anything right now? I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, put this particular issue best when he recently suggested in a letter to Congress that the issue here isn't about choosing between two sides in Syria, it's about choosing one among many sides. And that in his estimation, even if we were to choose sides, the side we chose wouldn't be in a position to promote their own interest or ours. That's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then there's the question of how Assad himself would react to U.S. action in Syria. If Assad views an air campaign as preparation for regime change, then he may lose all constraint in the use of his arsenal, chemical or otherwise, and lose any incentive whatsoever to move to the negotiating table. It's very clear that the unintended consequences of this strike could very well be a new cycle of escalation, which then drags us into a larger war than we're all seeking to avoid. Some have even suggested that the humanitarian crisis surrounding the Syrian civil war could actually be made worse, as a result of even targeted U.S. strikes. In the end, then, the president's proposal seems fundamentally flawed, since if it's too narrow, it may not deter Assad's further use of chemical weapons, but if it's too broad, it risks jeopardizing the security of these same stockpiles, potentially putting them into the hands of extremists. And that's why I think we're compelled in this case to apply a more traditional standard to whether to proceed with the use of force. One that asks a simple question: does Assad's use of chemical weapons pose a threat to the national security interest of the United States? And the answer to that question is fairly obvious. Even the president himself says it doesn't. Now, one could argue, as I've suggested, that there is an important national security concern at play, that we have a very strong interest in preserving the credibility of our commander-in-chief, regardless of the party in power, and in giving him the political support that reinforces that credibility. This is an issue I take very seriously. It's the main reason I wanted to take my time in making a final decision. But ultimately, I've concluded that being credible on Syria requires presenting a credible response and having a credible strategy. For all those reasons, I've indicated this proposal just doesn't pass muster. Indeed, if through this limited strike the president's credibility is not restored because Assad uses chemical weapons again, what then? and new targets aimed at toppling the regime, which end up jeopardizing control of these same chemical weapons stashes, allowing them to fall into the hands of al-Qaeda or others intent on using them against the United States or our allies, where would the cycle of escalation end? Now, last night we learned about a Russian diplomatic gambit to forestall U.S. military action through a proposal to secure and eventually destroy the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile. This morning there are initial reports that suggest Syria is supportive of it. Let me remind everyone that even if this is agreed to, it's still a long way off to reaching an agreement at the United Nations, to Syria gaining entry to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and to eventually securing and destroying the stockpile. As we've seen in my own state of Kentucky, where we've been working for 30 years to finally destroy a stockpile of chemical weapons, destroying chemical weapons is extremely challenging and requires a great deal of attention to detail and safety. Nonetheless, this proposal is obviously worth exploring. But more broadly, and this is my larger point, this one punitive strike we're debating could not make up for the President's performance over the last 5 years. The only way for him to achieve the credibility he seeks is by embracing the kind of serious, integrated national security plan that matches strategy to resources, capabilities to commitments, and which shows our allies around the world that the U.S. is fully engaged and ready to act at a moment's notice in all the major areas of concern around the globe, whether it's the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, or in the South China Sea. And just as importantly, that he's willing to invest in that strategy for the long term. In Syria, a limited strike would not resolve the civil war there, nor will it remove Assad from power. There appears to be no broader strategy to train, advise, and assist a vetted opposition group on a meaningful scale, as we did during the Cold War. What's needed in Syria is what's needed almost everywhere else in the world from America right now, a clear strategy and a president determined to carry it out. When it comes to Syria, our partners in the Middle East, countries like Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, all of them face real consequences from instability, refugee flows, and the growth of terrorist networks. Responding to this crisis requires a regional strategy and leadership. What we've gotten instead is an administration that seems more interested in telling us what the mission is not, more interested in telling us what the mission is not than what it is. We've gotten the same timid, reluctant leadership that I've seen from the President for nearly 5 years. As I've just said, this decision was not easy. When the President of the United States asks you to take a question like this seriously, you do so. Because just as our credibility in Syria is tied up with our credibility in places like Iran and North Korea, so too is the credibility of the Commander-in-Chief tied up to a large extent with America's credibility in general. There's no doubt about that. So let me repeat. I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with this President or any other in any case where our vital national security interests are threatened, our treaty allies are attacked, or we face an imminent threat. As for Israel, very few people, if anyone, expect that Syria would test its readiness to respond on its own, which just goes to show you the importance of credibility on the world stage. As Prime Minister Netanyahu put it last week, the enemies of Israel have very good reason not to test its might. But the Prime Minister should know nonetheless that America stands with him. I've never been an isolationist, and a vote against this resolution shouldn't be confused by anyone as a turn in that direction. But just as the most committed isolationists could be convinced of the need for intervention under the right circumstances when confronted with a threat, so too do the internationalists among us believe that all interventions are not created equal. All interventions are not created equal. And this proposal just does not stand up. So I'll be voting against this resolution.
Thank you, Mr. President. This week we have a very difficult set of questions to answer as it relates to Syria and the ongoing crisis there. But in particular, we have a question to answer as it relates to what the United States should do. So I rise this morning to express strong support for this authorization to degrade Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons capability and deter the future use of these horrific weapons. Now, I made this determination based upon the evidence and the national security concerns of the national security interests of the United States, both national security interests today as well as in the future. The resolution that's before the United States Senate right now does not allow for the deployment of U.S. combat troops on the ground in Syria. I will not support, nor do I think there be much support in this chamber, but I will not support any measure that would involve U.S. boots on the ground in Syria, and this resolution specifically speaks to this concern. And I'm quoting in part the resolution, quote, "The authority granted in Section 2A does not authorize the use of United States armed forces on the ground in Syria for the purpose of combat operations," unquote. So it's important that we make that point. As we've all seen, especially in the last few days, the situation in Syria is in flux, especially in the last 24 hours. The Russian government put forth a proposal yesterday which would have international monitors take control of Syria's chemical weapons in order to avert a U.S. military strike. I am open to this diplomatic discussion, however, not without caution and not without skepticism. Diplomatic solutions are always a preferred path, and military strikes should always be the last resort. I think prior to this proposal, we were at that point of a last resort. But the only reason that this proposal is on the table is because of the credible threat of force that is being debated here in Washington, but even most significantly being debated across the country. The authorization itself should still go forward because it will keep the pressure on the Syrian regime for a diplomatic solution. Now let's spend a couple minutes on our own national security interests. In March of 2011, as reported by the U.S. State Department, multiple news sources, including CNN, reported, and I'll submit for the record a report from CNN on this, that the Syrian government authorities had arrested 15 school children in the city of Dara for spray painting anti-government slogans. These young people were reportedly tortured while in custody, and authorities resorted to force when their parents and others in the community called for their release. Within 1 week, the police had killed 55 demonstrators in connection with the early efforts to provide opposition to the Assad regime. The regime committed countless atrocities during the next 2 years of this conflict, culminating in the unspeakable use, the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons on August the 21st. So, Mr. President, I would submit for the record a report from CNN dated March 1st, 2012, and ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
Now, this report is March of 2012, but it looks back in a retrospective fashion on what happened in those early days of the opposition coming together in 2011. And I'll read in pertinent part of what CNN said about what happened when these school children were demonstrating against the regime. They talked in this report about the young people, as I mentioned, not just protesting but spray painting their beliefs against the regime. And at the time, not a lot of people around the world were focused on what was happening in Syria. But let me quote in pertinent part. At one point, one of the commentators, or one of the citizens on the street was saying that people in Dara, quote, didn't want to go against the regime. People thought that this leader, Mr. Assad, was better than his father. Nobody wanted to go face to face with him. But then, of course, it was young people, in this case even school children, who led the way to take him on. So I submit that for the record because this opposition started on the streets of Syria, in this case in Dara, starting with young people. But it, of course, continued from there. And we know that the regime itself has the largest chemical stockpile in the region, one of the largest in the world. We know that Mr. Assad used these weapons against his own people, not only on August 21st, but on multiple occasions prior to that in a much more limited way. We also know that he has the capacity, the will, and unfortunately the track record to use these weapons against innocent civilians. We also should remember that we have troops and other military and diplomatic personnel in the region, in the Middle East. Even Syria's very acquisition of chemical weapons threatens our national security. In 2003, the Congress of the United States, and some people have forgotten about this, the Congress of the United States in 2003 passed the Syria Accountability and Lebanese Sovereignty Restoration Act of that year. This act explicitly states that Congress found, the United States Congress made a finding, quote, that Syria's acquisition, and I'm underlining that word, acquisition, of weapons of mass destruction threatens the security of the Middle East and the national security interests of the United States, unquote. So this Congress, 10 years ago, made a determination that the acquisition of chemical weapons was a threat to our national security. We are in a different world now. Syria not only acquired them, but has now used them multiple times on their own people, the most recent being the horrific scenes that we all saw in some of the videos that are now part of the public record. So there is clear and convincing evidence of the direct involvement of the Assad regime, the forces of the Assad regime, and senior officials in the planning, execution, and aftermath and attempts to cover up the August 21st attack. This was graphically evident in the 13 authenticated videos released by the Senate Intelligence Committee compiled by the Open Source Center showing the results of chemical weapons use in the Damascus suburbs on August 21st. These videos were shown to the Intel Committee on Thursday and were played on CNN on Saturday. So many Americans have seen them. And if you'd like more information about those, you can certainly go to my website and I'm sure many others as well. So it's clear that the regime violated international law as it relates to chemical weapons. We know that the regime committed a barrage of terror across the country with the sole aim of remaining in power. And so we have to ask ourselves, when a dictator or a terrorist organization uses chemical weapons in violation of international law, that regime or terrorist organization must pay a price or not. I would argue that they must pay a price. We simply can't condemn this crime against humanity. It is in the national security interest of the United States for the administration to have the authorization to act. The regime in Iran and the terrorist organization Hezbollah and the regime in North Korea are watching very closely, and it's imperative that we take steps to address this threat. Let me talk for a couple of minutes about the regime in Iran and Hezbollah. What happens in Syria is of great consequence to our security interests as it relates to that regime and Hezbollah, that regime meaning the Iranian regime. Their support for Hezbollah through Syria has resulted in constant plotting against the United States and its allies. The Assad regime in Syria is the conduit of this relationship between Hezbollah and the Iranian regime itself. So I support this authorization of targeted and strategic military action to hold the Syrian regime accountable, and because it will diminish the ability of Iran and Hezbollah to conduct acts of terror and to protect American lives if we hold them accountable, and of course the Syrian people. Indeed, other than Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah has killed more Americans than any other terrorist organization in the world, including 241 Marines in 1983. Hezbollah has consistently partnered with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to bolster Assad's campaign of repression and violence in Syria, further destabilizing the region. The regime in Iran has provided funds, weapons, logistical support, tactical advice, and fighters to the Syrian government forces. Just this year, Iran's support to Assad has increased with reported daily resupply flights to Syria. The Syrian regime possesses a stockpile of chemical weapons that we cannot allow to fall into the hands of terrorists. Iran and Hezbollah are already, I think some people in Washington miss this, they're not on the sidelines, they're already on the battlefield. And I would argue Iran and Hezbollah are on two battlefields. Certainly they're on the battlefield in Syria itself, but also the daily battlefield of terrorist acts, plotting against the United States and plotting against other countries as well. Failure to bring action and failure to hold Syria accountable after such a horrific crime will only serve to embolden the Iranian regime, to embolden the terrorist organization Hezbollah and others around the world to expand terror across the world. Iran's status as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism is well established, and its proxies have perpetuated attacks against the United States, Israel, and our allies. Emboldened by Iran's support, Hezbollah has conducted terrorist attacks since its inception in the early 1980s, including Western targets. Hezbollah has become more aggressive in the last few years, and it has executed attacks not only in the Middle East, but on two other continents, South Asia and Europe. Just 2 years ago, a plot was uncovered to blow up a restaurant in Georgetown, right here in Washington, D.C., to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States, along with U.S. officials and average citizens who are American. When the Iranian-backed attacker was questioned, he referred to the potential killing of Americans as, quote, no big deal, unquote. I'll submit the statement of the Department of Justice official report on the plot for the record. And I'd ask consent that this report by the Department of Justice entitled "Two Men Charged in Alleged Plot to Assassinate Saudi Arabian Ambassador to the United States." I'd submit that to the record.
Without objection.
So the list goes on. We know that in June of 1996, the bombing of Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, where 19 U.S. Air Force personnel were killed. That's another example of Iran-backed terrorist activity. It goes back as far as I mentioned to 1983 and the 241 Marines killed in a truck bombing in Beirut. There are also new reports on evidence that strongly suggests that an Iran-backed plot was underway to kill a U.S. ambassador in 2011. Hezbollah has consistently partnered with Iran to do just that. But the national security interest of the United States is even more significant than that. It's not simply the green light it would send to Iran and Hezbollah as it relates to terrorism. If we don't take the right action here, it would send a green light, or send a message and a green light to Iran as it relates to their nuclear program. We know that the Iranian regime is intent on developing nuclear weapons capability. I've supported a variety of measures to prevent Iran from acquiring that capability. Condemnation only of Syria would embolden Iran and undermine our efforts to prevent the Iranian regime from developing and possessing a nuclear weapon. Every member of Congress will have to weigh the consequence of giving the green light to the use of chemical weapons and contemplate what it will mean for enemies like the Iranian regime and Hezbollah who plot against the United States every day. Now, I'm like a lot of members of Congress. After receiving several intelligence briefings, I have more confidence than even before that we have a significant national security imperative to authorize the President to act as it relates to Syria. I have no doubt that Mr. Assad used the weapons, chemical weapons, against his own people, and it's evident that he crossed more than one red line. So I support this limited and proportional scope of authorization for the use of force. By the way, this authorization would be probably the most limited authorization in recent American history. So I believe that Congress must stand united on this issue, and we've got to make sure that we not only hold the regime accountable, but make sure that we're doing everything possible to send the right message. Two more points before I conclude, Mr. President. One of the best rationales for the reason that we were taking the steps that I hope we take was set forth in an op-ed this weekend by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, dated September 7, 2013. The op-ed is entitled "Pulling the Curtain Back on Syria," and I'd ask that this op-ed be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
I think one of the most important lines in here, I of course won't read the entire op-ed, but here's what Mr. Kristof says, and I'm quoting, quote, "While there are many injustices around the world, from Darfur to Eastern Congo, take it from one who has covered most of them. Syria today is the world capital of human suffering," unquote. There are few journalists, there are few Americans who have more credibility on the issue of what's happening to children and to vulnerable populations around the world than Nicholas Kristof. For him to say that the world capital of suffering is in Syria, the world capital of human suffering is in Syria, is a powerful and, I think, compelling statement. And that brings me back to where I started, Mr. President. I started walking through the early days of this opposition to a repressive regime against Mr. Assad. The people who led the way, in large measure, were children or young people making the case against his regime. One of the harrowing and very disturbing elements of this entire crisis, this war that's raged on for more than 2 years now, is the impact it's had on children. I received a report today that came from Save the Children, who have enormous credibility not only on children's issues worldwide, but they are actually Save the Children personnel around the ground in Syria. And I'd note for the record a document entitled Briefing Note, the Children Crisis in Syria, and ask that to be included in the record as well.
Without objection.
That documents in great detail the human suffering of children, the impact this has had on millions of Syrian children. But of course, maybe the most graphic and disturbing example of that was the footage that virtually every American has had an opportunity to view. The hundreds and hundreds of children who were killed instantly in this horrific chemical weapons attack. By one estimate, more than 400, maybe as many as 426 children killed. So when we confront this, we can't simply say, oh, this is just another horrific situation around the world. When you consider what this regime did to school children, arresting them, and by many accounts torturing them at the beginning of this opposition, all the way through to the attack on August the 21st. We're summoned by our conscience to consider what happened to children and what will continue to happen to children in Syria and in places around the world unless we act in some fashion or unless we hold this regime accountable. I want to be open to this possibility that maybe there's a breakthrough here, that we can remove this terrible threat from Syria and wipe out the chemical weapons threat by giving total and complete control of chemical weapons to an international force. But the burden of proof here is on Syria and the Russian Federation. And they have to deliver very specifically in a very short time frame if they expect us to agree to this. But we should be hopeful and consider this opportunity. But at the same time, we can't divorce ourselves from the reality of what happened here, the consequence of not acting, and also the long-term and short-term national security interests of the United States, which I think are overwhelming and compelling in this instance. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor. And
can you ask this consent, and then when you finish, ask consent?
Mr. President, I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And I would also ask consent that we recess.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
And the Senate is taking a break, their typical Tuesday break for their weekly party lunches, although this will be a little bit longer. That's because Democrats and Republicans will be meeting with President Obama on Capitol Hill shortly on the resolution to authorize military force against Syria. We expect the Senate to gavel back in at 2:15 Eastern. Of course, we'll have live coverage here on C-SPAN 2. In the next couple of hours, over the next couple of hours, till they come back, we're going to hear from you, your thoughts.